The twin suns hung high in the sky, casting a merciless glare over the barren expanse of the desert planet Oroshevan planet. The landscape stretched endlessly, a sea of golden dunes rippled by fierce winds. The air shimmered with heat, making the horizon dance like an illusion. It was a place that defied life, an unyielding realm of scorching sand and dry, suffocating winds. This, the alien teacher thought with satisfaction, would be the perfect test for her students. Professor Zarin, a towering figure with pale lavender skin and sharp, angular features, stood on a raised platform at the edge of the landing zone. Her long cloak billowed slightly in the hot wind, the fabric embedded with intricate symbols denoting her rank as a survival instructor for the Intergalactic Academy of Adaptation. She was renowned for her challenging methods and unflinching belief that most species in the galaxy lacked the resilience to survive without their precious technology. Her golden eyes scanned the group of students assembled before her, a diverse collection of beings from across the galaxy. "This," she announced, her voice carrying an authoritative edge, "is Orash 7, a planet where no species has survived more than a single planetary cycle without external assistance. Your task is simple: survive for 48 hours. Prove to me that you possess not only intellect, but the instincts necessary to endure." The students shifted nervously. Among them were representatives of some of the most advanced species in the galaxy. There was Lorak, a reptilian being from the humid swamps of Xylaris, whose scales glinted iridescently under the sun's rays. Beside him stood Mira, a delicate avian creature from the clouded skies of Mur, her feathers trembling in the arid wind. Next to her loomed Calyx, a heavily armored insectoid from the volcanic world of Brask, whose chitinous exoskeleton seemed impervious to the heat. Finally, almost unnoticeable in the crowd, was the lone human, a young woman named Stacy. Stacy stood quietly at the back of the group, her face partially obscured by a hood to shield her from the blistering sun. She was shorter than most of the others, her frame lean and unassuming compared to the imposing figures around her. Yet her eyes, a piercing shade of green, gleamed with quiet determination. She had joined the academy as part of an experimental program to study the adaptability of humans in extreme conditions. Her presence was regarded with skepticism by her peers, and Zarin in particular seemed to regard her as little more than a curiosity. "Humans," Zarin had once said during a lecture, "are an anomaly. Their survival stems not from innate superiority, but from sheer luck and primitive instincts. They are a species of improvisers, reliant on their crude methods and unrefined tools. It will be fascinating to see how long this one lasts." Now, as Zarin surveyed her students, her gaze lingered briefly on Stacy. The professor's lips curled into a faint smirk, as if already anticipating the human's failure. "You will each be provided with a standard survival kit," Zaron continued. "Inside you will find basic tools and rations sufficient for a single day. Beyond that, you are on your own. Use your environment, adapt, improvise, or perish." The students exchanged uneasy glances. The airlock of the ship hissed open, and a dozen drones floated out, each carrying a sleek metallic survival kit. As the drones distributed the kits, Stacy caught hers and examined its contents. Inside were a small multi-tool, a collapsible container for water, a single nutrient bar, a thermal blanket, and a rudimentary shelter device. It was hardly enough for 48 hours on a planet like this. But Zarin clapped her hands, and the sound echoed sharply in the arid air. "Your test begins now. Remember, this is not only about survival, it is about proving that you are more than the limitations of your species." With that, the group dispersed, each student heading in a different direction to begin their trial. Some activated their scanning devices immediately, searching for signs of water or shelter. Others took to the skies, their wings or hoverpacks carrying them above the dunes. Stacy, however, remained still for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She felt the weight of the desert's hostility pressing down on her, but she also felt a quiet resolve building within. She had spent years preparing for challenges like this. The deserts of Earth, harsh as they were, had taught her ancestors to endure with nothing but their wits and bare hands. This planet, she thought, would be no different. She glanced at her survival kit again, noting the scarcity of resources. Her peers, with their advanced biology and technology, might see this as a limitation, but Stacy saw it as an opportunity. She knew that survival wasn't about having the best tools. It was about understanding the environment and working with what it offered. Before setting out, she crouched down and scooped up a handful of sand, letting it fall through her fingers. The grains were fine and dry, but as she sifted through them, she noticed tiny fragments of salt crystals glinting in the sunlight. Salt often indicated the presence of water, or at least the remnants of it. She smiled faintly, her first clue already in hand. As the other students raced off with their gadgets and scanners, Stacy began walking, her steps steady and purposeful. She had no advanced equipment, no protective exoskeleton, no wings to carry her above the searing dunes. All she had was her knowledge, her instincts, and her will to survive, and that, she thought, would be enough. The heat grew more intense with each passing moment. The twin suns, relentless in their fury, seemed to mock the students as they ventured deeper into the unforgiving terrain of Orash 7. The desert stretched endlessly, a maze of dunes and jagged rock formations, offering no shade and little hope. The air shimmered with a mirage-like quality, distorting the landscape and playing tricks on the mind. The challenge was only beginning, but the strain was already palpable among the group. Stacy moved steadily across the shifting sands, her every step calculated to conserve energy. Her boots, designed for rugged environments, sank slightly with each step, forcing her to adjust her gait to avoid wasting strength. Unlike her peers, who relied heavily on their technology, she chose to rely on observation. Her eyes scanned the horizon for landmarks, unusual rock formations, patches of vegetation, anything that might provide a clue to the location of water or shelter. She knew that the desert, as hostile as it appeared, often held subtle signs of life beneath its barren surface. Elsewhere, the other students were faring less gracefully. Lorak, the reptilian student from Xylaris, had activated a thermal scanner built into his wristband, which emitted a soft hum as it searched for heat signatures. His scales glistened with sweat, a sign that even his species, adapted to swampy environments, was struggling to cope with the desert's dryness. He muttered to himself in frustration as the scanner failed to pick up anything useful. The device, designed for detecting large heat sources, was overwhelmed by the omnipresent heat of the sand and suns, rendering it nearly useless. Mira, the avian student, had taken to the skies, her lightweight frame and expansive wings allowing her to soar above the dunes. From above, she hoped to spot water or some form of shelter, but the view offered little more than an endless expanse of sand. Her feathers, so accustomed to the cool, misty atmosphere of her home planet, were beginning to dry out and lose their luster. She circled lower, frustrated by the lack of results, and began to feel the strain of the dry wind cutting through her once pristine plumage. Meanwhile, Calyx, the insectoid from Brask, relied on his exoskeleton to shield him from the heat. His heavy frame made him slower than the others, but he compensated with brute strength, digging into the sand with his clawed limbs in search of water. The effort, however, was draining, and the dry, powdery sand offered no resistance, making his attempts futile. He grumbled in his native tongue, cursing the planet's inhospitable nature as the sands continued to collapse into his shallow excavations. Stacy observed none of this, as she had chosen a different path. While the others scattered in various directions, she had decided to follow the faint traces of salt she had noticed earlier. Her keen eyes caught the occasional glint of crystals in the sand, leading her to suspect that water had once flowed in this area. The challenge now was to find where it might still exist, hidden beneath the surface or trapped in underground reservoirs. She paused at the base of a towering rock formation, its jagged edges casting a faint shadow on the sand. Though the shade was meager, it provided a brief reprieve from the sun's relentless glare. She crouched down and examined the ground more closely. Tiny, hardy plants with needle-like leaves clung to the base of the rocks, their roots burrowing deep into the sand. These plants, she knew, were a sign that moisture was present below the surface. She reached into her survival kit and pulled out the multi-tool, using its sharp edge to scrape away the top layer of sand. The ground below felt slightly cooler to the touch, confirming her suspicions. As she worked, Stacy's mind was calm and focused. She thought back to her training on Earth, where survival in extreme environments was a matter of both knowledge and discipline. She remembered her instructor's words: "The environment is not your enemy. Learn its patterns, understand its secrets, and it will guide you." She had internalized this lesson, and now, faced with the harshness of Orash 7, she felt a quiet confidence in her ability to endure. The silence of the desert was occasionally broken by distant sounds, grunts of frustration from Lorak, the rhythmic beating of Mira's wings, and the scraping noises of Calyx's claws against the sand. None of them seemed to be making progress, their advanced tools and natural adaptations proving insufficient against the planet's challenges. In contrast, Stacy's slow, deliberate approach began to yield results. She found a shallow depression near the rock formation where the sand was noticeably darker and more compact. This, she realized, could be a sign of subsurface water. She set to work, using the multi-tool to dig carefully into the ground. The sand grew cooler and slightly damp as she dug deeper, a promising indication that water was close. Her movements were methodical, each scoop of sand revealing a little more moisture. She felt a small surge of hope, but she knew better than to let it distract her. Survival was about persistence, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. As the suns began to dip lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the desert, Stacy paused to assess her progress. She had dug a hole nearly a meter deep, and the sand at the bottom was distinctly wet. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm that water was present. She leaned back on her heels, wiping the sweat from her brow, and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. While her peers struggled with their advanced gadgets and brute force, she had relied on instinct and knowledge, and it was paying off. Far in the distance, she spotted the faint silhouettes of the other students. They appeared scattered and disorganized, their movements betraying frustration and exhaustion. Stacy felt no sense of superiority, only a quiet determination to continue. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and this small success was just the beginning. There was still much to do, and the challenge was far from over. The day ended with the suns dipping below the horizon, the temperature dropping sharply as darkness enveloped the desert. Stacy used the thermal blanket from her survival kit to conserve her body heat, her mind already planning her next steps. She would need to extract and purify the water she had found, a task that would require both ingenuity and patience. As she lay beneath the star-filled sky, she felt a quiet pride in her efforts, but she knew that the true test of survival was only just beginning. Nightfall on Orash 7 transformed the desert into an entirely different world. The scorching heat dissipated, replaced by an almost unnatural chill that seeped into Stacy's bones. The stars above glittered with breathtaking clarity, but the cold winds sweeping across the dunes left no room for admiration. She wrapped herself tightly in the thermal blanket from her survival kit, her muscles stiff and her mind weary from the day's effort. The hole she had dug now lay before her, dark and silent, but it held the promise of life. Somewhere below the surface, water waited, hidden, elusive, but undeniably present. The silence was oppressive. There were no sounds of wildlife, no whispers of vegetation brushing in the breeze. Even the distant murmurs of her peers had faded into the vast emptiness of the desert. Stacy felt the weight of solitude pressing against her, a sharp reminder of just how isolated she was. She shifted her focus back to the task at hand. Survival in a place like this demanded not only physical endurance, but also mental fortitude. Dwelling on the enormity of her situation would only sap her strength. She crouched beside the hole, examining the damp sand she had unearthed earlier. It wasn't enough to dig and hope for the best. She needed a plan. Pulling out her multi-tool, she began to refine the edges of the pit, ensuring the walls wouldn't collapse as she worked. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each action deliberate and purposeful. Her training had taught her the importance of efficiency. Every movement needed to conserve energy. The process was grueling. As she dug deeper, the dampness increased, turning the sand into a sticky, resistant sludge. Her arms ached from the effort, and the sharp chill of the night only heightened her discomfort. Yet she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. Survival wasn't about comfort, it was about necessity. The moisture in the sand grew heavier, and the faint scent of wet earth reached her nose. It was a small victory, but it reignited her determination. By the time the first hint of dawn painted the horizon with soft hues of pink and orange, Stacy's pit had reached a depth of nearly 2 meters. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but the sight before her gave her a renewed sense of purpose. At the bottom of the hole, a shallow pool of water had begun to collect, glistening faintly in the early light. It wasn't much, just a thin layer, but it was enough to confirm that she was on the right track. Her heart raced with a mix of relief and triumph. Against the odds, she had found what so many believed was impossible on HFY. The next step was extraction. She retrieved the collapsible container from her survival kit and carefully scooped up the water, mindful not to disturb the sediment at the bottom. The liquid was murky, laced with fine particles of sand and traces of minerals. It wasn't safe to drink, not yet, but she had anticipated this. Her training had covered basic filtration methods, and she intended to put that knowledge to use. Stacy set up a makeshift filtration system, using the limited resources at her disposal. She lined a small funnel with strips of fabric torn from the edge of her thermal blanket, creating a crude filter. Slowly, she poured the water through the funnel, watching as the fabric caught the larger particles. The process was painstakingly slow, but it was effective. With each pass, the water grew clearer, until it finally resembled something drinkable. She held up the container, inspecting the liquid against the morning light. It wasn't perfect, but it would sustain her. As she took her first cautious sip, a wave of relief washed over her. The water was bitter and metallic, but it quenched her thirst like nothing she had ever experienced before. She savored each drop, knowing that this small victory could mean the difference between life and death in the days to come. While Stacy worked, the other students were facing mounting challenges. Lorak's thermal scanner had failed completely, its circuitry fried by the relentless heat of the previous day. Frustrated and dehydrated, he had resorted to aimlessly wandering the dunes, his reptilian physiology no longer offering the protection he had relied upon. Mira's feathers had become brittle, and the avian struggled to stay airborne in the turbulent winds of the desert. She had landed near a rocky outcrop, but her search for water had yielded nothing. Calyx, still determined to brute force his way to survival, had dug a series of shallow pits, each one collapsing in on itself and leaving him increasingly fatigued. The alien students had expected their advanced technology and unique adaptations to give them an edge. Yet HFY had proven to be an equalizer, stripping them of their advantages and exposing their vulnerabilities. They had underestimated the planet's challenges, just as they had underestimated Stacy. Unaware of the struggles of her peers, Stacy focused on preparing for the next phase of her plan. The water she had found would sustain her temporarily, but she knew it wasn't a long-term solution. She needed to identify a more stable source, something that could provide a continuous supply. Her mind raced with possibilities. The presence of water here suggested that there might be underground reservoirs or natural springs nearby. She needed to expand her search, but she also needed to balance caution with ambition. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and a single misstep could undo all her progress. As the day wore on, the heat returned with a vengeance. Stacy adjusted her strategy, using the shade of the rock formation to shield herself from the worst of the sun's rays. She rationed her water carefully, sipping only when absolutely necessary. Her movements were slow and deliberate, conserving energy as she continued to dig and refine her water source. Each small success fueled her determination, reinforcing her belief that survival was within her grasp. By late afternoon, Stacy's efforts had caught the attention of the alien teacher, Zaron. The professor had been monitoring the students' progress from a distance, her golden eyes narrowing as she observed their struggles. Zeron had expected the human to fail quickly, to succumb to the planet's challenges like so many before her. Yet here she was, not only surviving but thriving. The sight of Stacy's makeshift filtration system and carefully dug pit filled Zeron with a mix of curiosity and begrudging respect. She made a note to investigate further, though she refused to let her growing admiration show. As the suns dipped lower in the sky, Stacy paused to reflect on her progress. The desert was still a harsh, unforgiving place, but she no longer felt overwhelmed by its vastness. She had proven to herself that she could adapt, that her knowledge and instincts were enough to navigate even the most hostile environments. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she faced it with a quiet confidence, knowing that she had already achieved what many had deemed impossible. The next morning, the desert unveiled a new challenge. The air was still and heavy, the rising heat creating a suffocating blanket that pressed down on everything it touched. Stacy stirred from her light sleep, her body stiff from a night spent curled against the rocky outcrop. Her thermal blanket had provided some warmth against the chill, but the hard ground beneath her had done little to offer rest. Blinking against the harsh light of the twin suns, she stretched her aching limbs and began preparing for the day ahead. Her water supply was now minimal. The small pool she had uncovered the previous day had yielded enough for a handful of sips after filtration, but it was clear that it wouldn't be sufficient for long-term survival. She glanced down at the hole she had dug, now dry again except for a faint dampness clinging to the edges. The water she had collected was proof of possibility, but the challenge now was to find a more sustainable source. Stacy's gaze shifted to the horizon, scanning for clues. The desert seemed endless, the dunes rolling like frozen waves of gold. Yet she knew that no landscape was entirely barren. Her training had taught her that even the harshest environments held secrets for those who knew how to look. As her eyes adjusted to the glare, she noticed something faint in the distance. A jagged line against the otherwise smooth skyline. It wasn't another dune. It was darker and sharper, likely another rock formation. Its prominence suggested it might be larger than the one she had camped near. If her instincts were right, such a formation could act as a natural collector for water or even hide a subterranean spring. Determined, she packed her limited supplies and set out toward the distant shape. Her pace was steady, her movements deliberate to conserve energy. The desert sands shifted beneath her feet, each step a test of balance and endurance. The heat was already rising, beads of sweat forming on her brow as the suns climbed higher into the sky. She adjusted her hood to shield her face, her focus unwavering as she pushed forward. Elsewhere, the other students continued their struggles. Lorak, now visibly weakened, had abandoned his thermal scanner entirely. His once iridescent scales had dulled and his movements were sluggish as he wandered aimlessly through the dunes. Mira, perched atop a smaller rock outcrop, was furiously preening her feathers, trying to combat the dryness that had left them brittle and uneven. Calyx, the insectoid, had resorted to eating small, dried-out plants he had found scattered across the sand, his frustration evident in the erratic clicking of his mandibles. None of them had made significant progress, their initial confidence eroded by the relentless conditions of Orash. Stacy, in contrast, felt her determination growing with each step. The distant formation grew larger as she approached, its dark silhouette taking on more defined edges. The journey was grueling, the sun merciless, but she pressed on, her mind focused on the goal. As she drew closer, she began to notice subtle changes in the landscape. The sand near the base of the formation was darker, almost reddish in hue, and small clusters of hardy plants dotted the area. These plants, with their thick, waxy leaves, were a clear sign of moisture. She reached the base of the formation just as the suns reached their zenith. The rocks were massive, jagged monoliths jutting out of the sand like the bones of some ancient creature. Their surfaces were rough and pitted, evidence of centuries of erosion by wind and sand. Stacy circled the base, her eyes scanning for any signs of water. She noted small cracks and crevices in the rock, some of which held patches of green moss, a sure indicator of dampness. Her attention was drawn to a particularly deep crevice at the base of the largest rock. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, but the air emanating from it was noticeably cooler. She crouched down and peered inside, her heart pounding with anticipation. The darkness of the crevice concealed its depth, but the faint glimmer of moisture on the rock walls was enough to spur her into action. Using her multi-tool, she began to carefully widen the opening, chipping away at the edges to create enough space to crawl through. The work was slow and labor-intensive, each strike sending small shards of rock scattering across the sand. Her hands ached and sweat dripped down her face, but she refused to stop. The promise of water, of survival, drove her forward. After what felt like hours, the crevice was finally wide enough to allow her passage. She slid inside, her movements cautious as she navigated the narrow space. The air within was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the searing heat outside. The darkness pressed in around her, but she pressed on, guided by the faint sound of dripping water echoing in the distance. Her heart raced as the sound grew louder. The passage widened slightly, and she found herself in a small chamber. In the center, a shallow pool of water glistened in the dim light filtering through the cracks above. It was pristine, untouched, a hidden treasure in the heart of the desert. Stacy knelt beside the pool, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she cupped her hands and scooped up the cool, clear water. She drank deeply, the liquid revitalizing her parched body. The discovery was more than she could have hoped for. The pool was large enough to provide a sustainable source of water, and its location within the rock formation offered natural protection from the elements. She quickly began devising a plan to transport water back to her camp, using the collapsible container from her kit. Each trip would be arduous, but the reward was worth the effort. As she emerged from the crevice, the suns were beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. Stacy felt a renewed sense of purpose as she made her way back to her camp, the container of water sloshing gently with each step. She knew that her success wasn't just a personal victory. While her peers had faltered, relying on technology and brute force, she had embraced the simplicity of observation and adaptation. The desert had tested her, and she had risen to the challenge. Back at her camp, she carefully stored the water and began preparing for the night. The desert's cold would return soon, and she needed to ensure her shelter was secure. As she worked, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her accomplishments. She had proven that survival wasn't about having the best tools or the most advanced technology. It was about understanding the environment and working with it. Stacy sat by her small campfire, the stars once again illuminating the vast expanse above. The journey was far from over, but she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had discovered not just water, but a deep well of strength within herself, and she knew, without a doubt, that she would endure. The desert seemed quieter that morning, as if Orash 7 itself was waiting to see what would unfold. The twin suns had barely risen, their light creeping over the horizon and painting the dunes in hues of amber and gold. Stacy sat cross-legged at her camp, her back against the rock formation that had become her haven. The container of water she had carried back from the hidden pool was nearly full, resting beside. She sipped cautiously, savoring each drop. This water was her victory, a reminder of the balance she had struck between determination, knowledge, and adaptability. Yet, even as she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, she knew the test wasn't over. Across the desert, the other students were nearing their limits. Lorak the reptilian stumbled across the sands, his once confident gait reduced to a slow, staggering shuffle. His scales were cracked and dull, his energy sapped by dehydration and frustration. Mira had abandoned her attempt to fly, her brittle feathers unable to withstand the dry, abrasive winds. She perched on a jagged outcrop, her head bowed as she tried to shield herself from the suns. Calyx, the insectoid, had burrowed shallow pits into the sand in a desperate bid for moisture, but his efforts had yielded nothing. Their initial pride and reliance on technology had betrayed them, leaving them vulnerable to the harsh realities of Orash 7. Stacy watched the horizon, her gaze calm and steady. She had spent the previous evening refining her plan, knowing that her survival wasn't enough to teach the others how to adapt. Her instinct wasn't to gloat or revel in their failures, but to extend the knowledge she had gained. This wasn't about competition. It was about understanding that survival required humility and a willingness to learn. She stood, adjusting her hood against the growing heat, and began preparing to leave her camp. The water from the pool had been a gift, but it wouldn't last forever. She needed to ensure the others could reach it as well, though the journey would test their endurance and willingness to listen. Slinging the container of water over her shoulder, she set out toward the general direction where she had last seen her peers. The trek was arduous, the suns climbing higher and burning away the early morning coolness. The sands shifted beneath her boots, the wind carrying faint whispers of desolation. Stacy moved with purpose, her eyes scanning for signs of her fellow students. She spotted the first of them, Lorak, half buried in the sand, his movements sluggish as he clawed weakly at the ground. His scanner had been abandoned beside him, its once sleek casing now coated in dust. She approached him carefully, her voice calm but firm. "You need to stop," she said, crouching beside him. "This isn't working." Lorak looked up, his yellow eyes dull and filled with exhaustion. I can't," he rasped. "There's nothing here." "There is," Stacy replied, her tone resolute. She unslung her container of water and held it out to him. "Drink." He hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. Eventually he reached for the container, his clawed hand trembling as he brought it to his lips. The water seemed to revive him almost instantly, his scales regaining a faint sheen as he drank. When he lowered the container, his gaze shifted to Stacy, confusion and gratitude mingling in his expression. "How?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I'll show you," she said simply. "But you have to trust me." Together they continued toward the rock formation where the hidden pool awaited. Along the way, they encountered Mira and Calyx, both of whom were in similarly dire straits. Mira's feathers had lost their luster entirely, and she seemed barely able to lift her head. Calyx's usually powerful frame was hunched, his movements uncoordinated. Stacy offered them both water, urging them to follow her. Though their pride was evident in the way they avoided meeting her gaze, their survival instincts overruled their egos. The group's progress was slow but steady. Stacy led the way, her steps purposeful as she retraced her path toward the rock formation. She explained her observations as they walked, pointing out the subtle signs of moisture she had noticed, the color of the sand, the clusters of hardy plants, the faint scent of wet earth carried on the wind. Her voice was calm and patient, never condescending, as she shared what she had learned. By the time they reached the crevice, the suns were nearing their zenith. The others stared at the narrow opening, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and awe, as Stacy gestured for them to follow her inside. She led them through the cool, dark passage, the sound of dripping water growing louder with each step. When they emerged into the chamber, the sight of the shallow pool left them speechless. "This is how we survive," Stacy said, kneeling beside the water. "Not with scanners or brute force, but by understanding the environment and working with it." Lorak, Mira, and Calyx took turns drinking from the pool, their earlier doubts replaced by quiet gratitude. The water revitalized them, giving them the strength to think clearly for the first time in days. They began to ask questions, their curiosity overcoming their initial skepticism. Stacy answered patiently, demonstrating how to set up a basic filtration system and how to recognize signs of water in the desert. As the group worked together, a figure appeared at the entrance to the chamber. Professor Zaron stood in the shadows, her golden eyes observing the scene with a mixture of surprise and respect. She had been monitoring the students from afar, expecting their struggles to teach them the harsh realities of survival. Yet what she saw now was beyond her expectations. The human, whom she had dismissed as primitive and unremarkable, had not only survived, but had become a leader, guiding her peers with a wisdom born of experience. Zeron stepped forward, her voice echoing in the chamber. "You've done well," she said, addressing the group but looking directly at Stacy. All the students turned to her, their expressions a mix of pride and relief. Stacy met Zaren's gaze, her green eyes steady and unflinching. She didn't need the professor's validation to know what she had accomplished, but the acknowledgement was still meaningful. Zaren's gaze softened. "Survival isn't just about endurance," she said. "It's about learning, adapting, and helping one another. Today, you've proven that humanity's greatest strength lies in its ability to thrive where others falter." The group returned to the surface as the suns began to set, their silhouettes outlined against the golden light. They had faced the harshness of Orash 7 and emerged not just as survivors but as a team, united by their shared struggle. For Stacy, the journey had been more than a test of physical endurance. It had been a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of her species. As the desert winds carried away the last traces of the day's heat, she felt a quiet pride in what she had accomplished. She had not only survived, she had transformed the desert into a lesson in survival for all who dared to face it.